The courtroom was cold, too cold. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow on the cracked wooden benches. The clock ticked, slow, deliberate. Every sound seemed louder in the silence. A man sat at the defendant's table, older, weathered, but composed. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers steady. His face was carved with years of stories left untold, deep lines around his eyes, the kind only war or regret could etch. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the file in front of him. He smirked, just barely, like he'd seen this case 100 times before. "Mr. Harlan?" The judge's voice echoed, casual, almost amused. "Another veteran thinking he's above the law?" A few muffled chuckles rippled through the room. The prosecutor smirked, tapping his pen against the desk. The old man didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, at nothing, or maybe at everything. The judge's smile widened. He thought this would be easy, but something in the air shifted, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift only a few people in the room could feel. Harlan's eyes slowly lifted, just enough to meet the judge's gaze. There was something behind them, something locked away, a storm waiting. He didn't speak. Not yet. The judge leaned forward, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. "Let's make this quick, shall we?" The clock ticked again. Harlan blinked once. The storm was coming. The judge flipped through the papers with one hand, barely glancing up. His smirk lingered, sharp, condescending. "Says here you're facing trespassing charges, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace." He dragged out each charge, his voice slow, mocking. "Quite the resume, Mr. Harlan." A few soft laughs echoed from the back row. The prosecutor scribbled something down, lips curling. Harlan didn't move. His breathing steady, eyes locked straight ahead. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I see your military service here. Honorable discharge." He paused, smirking. "But that was decades ago, wasn't it?" His words hung in the air like bait, daring Harlan to bite. "You must have forgotten that out here. You're just another civilian." The room shifted, so subtle most wouldn't notice. Harlan's knuckles tightened slightly against the table, but he stayed silent. The judge's smile grew wider. He liked this. The power, the control. "You see, Mr. Harlan, I respect our veterans." His tone was syrupy sweet, a thin mask for the venom underneath. "But the law doesn't bend just because someone wore a uniform. A long, long time ago." More laughter, polite, distant. Still. Harlan said nothing. His silence was starting to feel heavier, like something pressing down on the room. The judge leaned back again, tapping his pen against the desk. "This is how it works now." He smiled wider. "You follow the rules, or you pay the price." For the first time, Harlan's eyes flicked toward him, slow, deliberate. It was only a second, but the judge shifted in his chair. He felt it. Something was off. He just didn't know what yet. The courtroom was still. The judge's smirk hadn't faded yet, but something about Harlan's silence was starting to itch at him. "Well," the judge prodded. "Cat got your tongue, soldier?" Finally, Harlan moved. Just slightly. He adjusted his sleeves, smooth, unhurried. When he spoke, his voice was steady. Too steady. "Your Honor," he said, tilting his head, "before we continue, do you have the proper clearance to proceed?" The words landed like a pin drop in a silent room. Small, insignificant, but somehow wrong. The judge let out a dry chuckle, glancing toward the prosecutor. "Clearance?" he scoffed. "This is a trespassing case, not a classified operation." The prosecutor chuckled too, hesitant, forced. He flipped through his notes as if looking for something he might have missed. Harlan didn't react. He just sat there, composed. The judge's smirk wavered, barely. But it did. Harlan exhaled through his nose, slow. "If you don't have clearance," he continued, voice like granite, "you might want to stop now." A pause. A small one. Barely noticeable. The bailiff shifted near the door. The judge's fingers twitched, just once, before he scoffed again, louder this time, like he needed to regain control. "I don't need clearance to rule on your mistakes, Mr. Harlan." His tone sharpened. "You think dropping cryptic nonsense will get you off the hook?" Harlan said nothing. The judge tapped his gavel. "We'll proceed as scheduled. This is a waste of taxpayer money, and quite frankly, a disgrace." Harlan reached into his coat. Not fast, not aggressively, just deliberately. The prosecutor stiffened. The bailiff's stance changed, barely perceptible. The judge swallowed. And then Harlan placed it on the table. A single file, thick, stamped. Red ink bled across the cover. Silence. And for the first time, the judge didn't have a snarky remark. The judge's smirk vanished, like someone had cut the power behind his eyes. The courtroom felt heavier now, the air thicker. No one laughed. No one moved. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. Harlan leaned forward, just an inch, calm, unshaken. "You said, I'm just another civilian." His voice was low, measured. "But this file says otherwise." The judge's throat bobbed, one quick swallow. His fingers tapped the desk. Faster now. Harlan's eyes never left him. "You want to talk about the law, Your Honor?" He slid the file forward with 2 fingers. "Let's talk about who writes it." The judge's hand hovered over the file, hesitant. He glanced at the prosecutor. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Nobody helped him. Harlan leaned back again, slow, patient. "Go ahead," he murmured. "Open it." The room held its breath. Sweat traced down the judge's temple. His fingers fumbled with the clasp. When the file opened, the color drained from his face. 1 page, 2 words, stamped beneath it. The judge's hand trembled. His mouth opened. But nothing came out. Harlan watched him, calm, composed. Now everyone in the room knew. The man they'd mocked could bury them all. The judge's breath quickened, shallow, uneven. His eyes darted across the classified pages, scanning names, dates, operations buried beneath layers of silence. Operations he had no clearance to even read. His hands shook as he closed the file, too quickly, like it might burn him if left open too long. Harlan leaned forward again, slow, deliberate. His voice cut through the thick air. "You were saying something about following the rules, Your Honor?" The judge flinched, just barely, but everyone saw it. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Jurors exchanged glances. Even the bailiff's hand hovered near his radio, waiting, unsure who the real threat in the room was anymore. Harlan's gaze locked onto the judge, unblinking. "I served this country in places you don't even know exist," he said quietly. "Men like you, sign papers." He paused, let the weight settle. "Men like me, make sure you wake up safe enough to mock us." The judge's face drained white. His gavel sat untouched on the desk. Harlan stood, slow, steady. He buttoned his coat, the file tucked neatly back under his arm. He leaned in one last time. "You're not above the law." His voice was a razor's edge. "You just never met someone who could enforce it." Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the judge frozen, exposed, and very, very small.